we got a new camera, which has also just introduced a whole bunch of other issues, but that's besides the point. Welcome back to the bookcase. So I initially wanted to do a spoiler-free review of The Lost Metal. I had a whole review written of what I felt was fair game stuff for a spoiler-free review. And before I went to record, I made sure to go watch some other spoiler-free reviews just because I've never done a review of a newly released work before, so I wanted to make sure I was following, the proper etiquette. From that, I rapidly surmised that I had given away way too much in my initial review, so I threw that script out. I think my issue is I watch a lot of movie reviews on the FilmTube side of things, and the thing about movie reviews is even if you're going spoiler-free, because trailers have so much stuff in them, there's kind of this expectation of the cultural osmosis of what we're going to get out of trailers, so these things are like fair game to talk about with your audience, even in a spoiler-free context. Basically, the film already gave its own elevator pitch to the audience. So with that consideration in mind, I started over, wrote a completely new review with no allusions to the plot whatsoever. It sucked. What I was trying to encapsulate was what I feel people are looking for when they go to a spoiler-free review from a book reviewer. They don't want the details of the plot. Actually, most of them want nothing, period. The way people are consuming written media as opposed to visual media is completely different. People want to go into these books 100% blind, so they don't want the reviewer to talk about what's in the book. They just want the reviewer to tell them if the book is worth it. People are going to reviewers who they respect, and they're basically asking the question, is this book worth the 10 to 15 hours it's going to take Mr. Joe Schmo every reader to read it? Is it likely that I will enjoy this book? I tried to encapsulate that in my new script, but the problem was everything I wrote just felt so non-committal. I get the feeling that's my inexperience talking. Most books I read, I want to discuss the nuances of. I have trouble saying something is good or bad and leaving it at that, or even going for generalized things like I liked the interplay of the characters, or I think this arc was really well executed. There's nuances I want to discuss, but I feel like discussing those nuances entails those little spoilers. Sometimes I even feel like my own reactions are sort of spoilers. So I gave up on that script and started on this, my final script for this video. So we'll call this a Reviewscussion. I want to give you my thoughts on this book and why I think it's worth reading, but I also want to be free to talk about the elements that make it work and then don't work for me. So we'll call this Spoiler-Lite. As a Spoiler-Lite review, you can expect me to talk about plot elements mostly from the setup, the first act of this story. I may also bring up some elements about what's going to be happening later on, more just so you would know the direction the story is taking. But I'll be taking a distinct effort in this first part of the review to not mention anything past the initial setup. Later on, we'll have a section where I discuss, the more in-depth, spoilery parts of the book. I don't necessarily want to break down the end of the book, or even to summarize what's going on. I just want to talk about, again, those things that do and don't work for me and break down the nuances of why. As I said in a previous video, I don't think that this video is in any way a replacement for actually reading and experiencing the book yourself. I'll say right up front, I think this book is worth reading. I think it's a great conclusion to the second era of the Mistborn series, and I think it's worth reading all of the prerequisite books that it took to get there. And if you want to hear what I have to say prior to reading this new book, cool. Thanks. I appreciate that. But if you want to go into The Lost Metal with zero context, this is not the review for you. You should just stop watching this video right now. Go watch Daniel Green's video or Michael Knipp's video. Those were some of the ones that I watched just to get a feel for what other people's spoiler-free videos were like, and those were the ones that I largely agreed with. There are other opinions out there, other good reviews, but those were the two who I watched, and I felt, yeah, I pretty much agree with what they've got to say about it. So with that out of the way, let's finally get this thing moving. The Lost Metal is finally here! The Lost Metal is the 7th novel in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, and the 4th novel in its second era. It's also the latest installment in his Cosmere setting. If you are watching this and somehow uninitiated, the Cosmere is basically Brandon Sanderson's sort of expanded universe setting with different planets with their own magic, with individual stories that play out on those worlds, with sort of a loose connection of the premise. For the most part, when you're talking about a Cosmere book, mentioning what the Cosmere is unimportant. But for this book, Brandon Sanderson has openly said in the promotion for The Lost Metal, this is the most Cosmere book in the Cosmere so far. He's not joking. Besides that, as I said before, this book is the final book in the second era of the Mistborn series. Descriptions within descriptions. That era is comprised of the Alloy of Law, Shadows of Self, the Bands of Mourning, and now, The Lost Metal. That is to say that this book is not just the latest book in a series, it's also the last installment in a sectioned part of the series. This is a finale. So this book is not only handling expanded universe shenanigans, but it also has to serve as a satisfying conclusion for the characters and their arcs that they've been having so far in this section of the story. So let's actually talk about the characters. The cast has moved on significantly from where they were since the last book ended. We've had a 6-year time skip, and everybody's moved on pretty far with their lives. Wax, along with Steris, have taken up an active role in the politics of the city, doing their best to stop the machinations of the Set, our series' conspiratorial villains. Most recently, they've been trying to stop the Elendel Senate from taking actions which would cause the outlying settlements to take up arms against them, starting a civil war. They're also parents now. Good for them. A side note, Wax's son is named Max, and at first I hated this, but then I remembered that bit from the beginning of Shadows of Self in the flashback prologue, where Leslie makes fun of Wax for naming his horse, I think it was Destroyer, because it was a timid horse and he was hoping the name would inspire her. I guess I just decided at this point, Wax being bad at naming things is just a part of his character. I'm not saying you need to like it, but I am saying that it amused me for that reason. Moving on, Marcy is a full-time detective now. And she's a good one at that. Wayne is serving as her partner, and they fight the Set in a more direct way through criminal investigation. Until things break down, at which point they then fight the Set in an even more direct way, which involves just so many bullets. The story takes a hot minute to describe its stakes and get things going, and this is actually where my first issue is. Basically, the fantastical metal from the previous book that allows non-Metalborn to use those abilities, with some caveats, is now known to be Harmonium, the divine metal associated with harmony, in the same way that Atium was associated with ruin, and Lerasium, the metal which causes someone to become Mistborn, was associated with preservation. In experiments being done to separate Harmonium into its base components, Atium and Lerasium, it's discovered that when separated, there's a very explosive reaction. A reaction which the gang finds could be city-destroying on a large enough scale. Basically, they split the magical atom. Wax knows that his sister, a high-ranking member of the Set, and her cronies would be conducting the same kinds of experiments, and have very likely had this information themselves for quite a while. From there, things spin into a thriller of a tale as the gang tries to stop this discovery from ending life as they know it. I actually do like this premise a lot. It ties itself well into what I've enjoyed about the Era 2 books so far, in that they're tying the progress of this world to the magic in this world that already exists. It's really good stuff. What bugs me is that there's a lot of stuff happening with some of the subplots here that I really think should have just been sprinkled throughout the book. See, there's a lot of information that comes up in the setup that turns out to be not as relevant as you would expect for the rest of the book. Now, that stuff in a vacuum is good. I like it, but having read the whole book, it just kind of sticks out. Stick a pin in this, we're going to come back to it during spoiler talk, but just understand that those are the reasons I find this setup a little weird retroactively. But those details aside, this story has a really strong hook for what its characters need to be doing, and I like the way that Sanderson uses his characters in this story. I'll start with saying the big main character for this era, Wax, he has more or less concluded his character arc and his character development by the time this book has begun. As of the end of the Bands of Mourning, he'd basically come out the other end of his character gauntlet, and was better for it. The important one for this book actually ends up being Wayne. I don't think that's a spoiler at all because anybody could tell you that as soon as they started reading the first chapter, the prologue, and they saw that it was from his point of view. Now, Wayne's elevated importance is going to be something that's hit or miss for some people. The thing about Sanderson's humor is it's one of those love it or hate it things. I personally fall in the middle in a way where some things work and some things just don't. For example, I don't hate Lift in the Stormlight archive, but whenever her point of view pops up, it's very, very rare for me to go, yeah, a Lift chapter! On the other hand, though, I really like Wayne. A big part of what has made that work for me is just that the second era of Mistborn books are a very different beast from Sanderson's other Cosmere works, from the Stormlight archive to even something like the first era of Mistborn. We're actually going to go off script here for just a moment. A lot of the negative criticism that I have seen leveled towards this book and toward Era 2 in general has been something that I would categorize as people just not being down for sort of the change in genre from a high fantasy affair to an adventure action shooty affair. For the record, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. That's not an invalid criticism. I think it communicates to a lot of people who, if they're not on board for the shooty bang bang fun times, they probably won't enjoy the books for the same reason that they enjoyed the initial Mistborn trilogy. But I think the proper way to engage with the second era of Mistborn books is to not view them as something in the space of stuff like The Lord of the Rings. These books have more in common with Indiana Jones, if we're being honest here. All of that said, we're back on script now. Wayne fits really well into these stories as the wisecracking sidekick type. And that's because these are just the kind of stories that have characters like that. Mistborn decided it was going to trade its high fantasy hat for a Western duster, and I was all on board. Even if it's not what I would normally come to Sanderson for, and even if I still prefer the setting of the Final Empire, I still like this a lot. I think the big thing that does it for most people, though, with Wayne is just how quirky he is. He's the kind of character who just sort of does the screwball thing to get a laugh out of people, or even when other people aren't around, he's still doing the screwball thing, but in a way that shows the reader that his worldview is unorthodox, to say the least. I get why this doesn't work for people, and I don't think anybody's obligated to enjoy it for those reasons. I don't think anybody's wrong to think that Wayne is annoying, but I like him. I just think Wayne is interesting. I've always been a sucker for the comic relief character who hides a tragic backstory, and their whole thing is that they're funny to hide a deep sadness or guilt within. I can see some people feeling like the direction that Wayne's story takes in this book is a little bit cliche, but I thought it was fitting. And I like how, despite still being the main character and the primary driving force of this story, Wax's character kind of takes a back seat to Wayne's here. There's one particularly sweet moment between the two of them that just really cements the brotherly relationship that they have. If you've read it, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but it's just sweet. I love it. I also really enjoy Steris in this book. She's not quite at the forefront the way that she was in the Bands of Mourning, but she still has a lot to do here that is appropriate for her character to be doing. She's got a side plot that's just perfect for her character that gets just the right amount of screen time, and we get to see her grow and develop from where she left off in the last book. Honestly, it's perfect for her. I wish she got a little more interplay with the rest of the cast here, but what I get, I enjoyed. I really like Steris, and I'm glad she didn't get sidelined. And then we have Marasi. Everything I want to say about Marasi is spoilers. Put a pin in that, we'll get back to it. But let's talk about something I hated. Milan just leaves. The interaction between her and Wayne was some of my favorite stuff from the last two books, and it sucks that she gets like 2 scenes here, and then she just nopes right on out of the story. This just hurts because it tastes like missed potential. I can see how her being there impacts the way that Sanderson wants to go through Wayne's arc here. It doesn't really work for what he wants to do with him if Milan is present. But the way she exits is just so clunky. I usually expect better from Sanderson. There's not even a lot to talk about here because the thing I'm talking about is how there isn't really anything to talk about. And I don't like it. I can't like it, Taylor.
I don't like it.
I can't like it.
I can't like it.
She got done dirty. There's some interesting setup for what her character could be doing later, but that does not mitigate the problems which are occurring now. See, I would say a lot of the issues in this book come from the fact that it's existing in a larger universe, and it's going to have things in it that don't necessarily pay off in this book. But the thing about that is you can set up things in a book that don't pay off in that book. It's for future book. It's for future book.
It's for future book.
You can leave things open. You can not resolve things and leave them off for different books, because that's what you do with sequels. But there's two things here that need to happen that I feel like they just aren't happening. Thing number first is you need to make sure... That's on purpose. I see you looking at me.
I'm judging you.
Thing number first is you need to make sure that whatever the element is that's being set up is at a satisfying point for the book that it's being left off at. This isn't to say you can't leave things hanging, that's kind of the point. But that brings me to thing number B. You need to make sure that the reader doesn't expect answers in this book for the things that they're not going to get answers for. Keep this in mind because you'll start to notice that the issues in this book largely stem from a bad case of what I call expanded universe-itis. Actually, let's talk about the expanded universe for a second. As I said before, this book is, by the author's own admission, the most Cosmere a Cosmere book has ever been. So what exactly does that mean? Sometimes it means important stuff. Other times, it means references. See, this is the first novel in the Cosmere we've had where the explicit threat, Trell, the god worshipped by the set, is in fact not locally from this system. Much like Sazed, who wields Harmony, the two shards of Preservation and Ruin, Trell is an alias for another shard wielder trying to muscle in on Sazed's divine turf. As such, yes, this book is inevitably tied to the external Cosmere because its threat is explicitly external. But then there's all the other stuff. Here's another thing that I could see some people disagreeing with me on. I find a lot of people these days tend to look down on what they view as gratuitous fan service. Things that are just included so the audience can recognize them. I'm not going to say what I'm explicitly talking about for now, but there are nods to the other Cosmere worlds in this book, several in fact. Things that are in there for the purpose of making the reader go, I clapped! I clapped when I saw it! My wife just looked at me.
When they saw! I clapped when I saw!
But the thing is, I did clap when I saw it. This is sort of a double-edged sword, because yeah, referencing other books in the Cosmere so people can recognize them could be viewed as low-hanging fruit, but I would argue that when we're talking about a number of unnecessary books which exceed the number of books already in this series, we've gone from the realm of low-hanging fruit to deep cuts. I do think the elements that are here aren't overly gratuitous, and if I'm honest, they aren't entirely necessary either, but they do serve to forward one of our primary plot threads and character arcs. In that sense, they do have some utility. It's just that usually once something from another world exits the scene, it ceases to be important. I also want to say I do think that reading all of those other books is unnecessary to enjoy this one. Now, I think I personally gleaned a greater enjoyment having read them all, but I think a reader could enjoy The Lost Metal if the only books that they'd read so far were the Mistborn books. Now, I don't know that because I can't magically go back and unread these books so that I can then just read these ones, but maybe someone else has had that experience, and I'm sure whoever that someone is, they have an opinion that completely invalidates mine. But if you're in a hurry but still want to do some background Cosmere reading for this book, I recommend picking up Elantris and the Emperor's Soul. If you're not in a hurry, you can read everything else, which includes Warbreaker, all 4 Stormlight books, which are just absolute units of literature, as well as a few other novellas. Or you could just not read any of them. You can just pick up The Lost Metal as the first book that you read if you want. I'm not your dad.
Oh, yeah, Dad. I want to read the Lost Metal.
Now I think I've said all I can say without getting to spoilers, so let's get into the nitty gritty. Here's my spoiler warning, go to the timecode below to skip past it. This is the part where I'm talking about stuff that I really think is better experienced reading the book the first time on your own. But if you've decided you want to keep watching, I won't judge. Alright, if you're still here, you're still here. Let's go. Earlier I said that a lot of the problems in this book stem from the fact that it has to hearken to a lot of other books for questions it's not going to answer here. That's something that happens on a series level and on an expanded universe level. But let's talk about the series level first as we pull out pin number 1. So I said this book spends a lot of time setting up something that isn't super relevant through the rest of the book. That is the impending threat of the Malwish peoples on the southern continent to the peoples of the northern continent. Now I want to clarify, I think what's going on there is really cool. This is an awesome element with huge potential payoff. My problem is that a good chunk of this book's opening is spent building up that threat like it's going to be something that's important here. I'm sad to tell you it's not. It's a very cool setup for what I'm anticipating is going to be like a Cold War thing that's going on in the new Mistborn trilogy. But my problem is the fact that all of this information being front-loaded in the first act of the story makes it feel to the reader like there needs to be some kind of payoff for it in this book. I really think the solution for this is to just not front-load that information in the first act. The way that that part of the narrative is being presented at the beginning of the book really made me think like it was going to be really important for the rest of the story. I wouldn't call myself a great writer, but I think that maybe this could be telegraphed a bit better as a future setup if it was somehow made to come at a later time in the story. Like, I'm not saying that plot thread needs to be tied up. Like, that plot should still have unresolved tension when this story wraps up. I just think that the issue is that where that information is presented in this book makes the reader feel like there needs to be a greater payoff for it, or just a payoff at all. Now, on to pin number 2. Let's talk about Marasi, because it's hard to talk about Marasi without talking about some of the more spoilery elements of this story and its more interesting twists. Here's actually a second spoiler alert. This is going to be a spoiler alert within the spoiler alert. See, this one actually entails some spoilers from the Stormlight Archive to talk about entirely, so just skip to the timecode below if you want to avoid any spoilers for the Stormlight Archive up through the latest Stormlight book as of this moment, The Rhythm of War. This is just to skip those spoilers. You won't go to the end of the spoiler section, you'll just go to the end of the part that has Stormlight spoilers. So Marasi's whole thing is that she's become a successful detective on the constabulary, but she feels like the small stuff that she's doing just isn't making a big enough difference. When she was younger, she dreamed of eradicating crime, not by fighting it more successfully, but by reforming the constabulary and the parts of society which contribute to the problems which cause people to turn to crime. And now here she is just fighting crime. Her part to play in everything that's happening is that there are actually 2 doomsday threats. One is the bomb, which everybody else is working on, and the other is an otherworldly army of advanced, highly technological super soldiers that'll destroy them all if the bomb doesn't do it first. To that end, she finds herself being assisted and scouted by a group of friendly, otherworldly people. These people are part of a group whose express purpose is to protect Scadrial from external threats in the Cosmere, and they're prepared to use their bizarre powers to do just that. These guys are Kelsier's ragtag group, the Ghostbloods. They've been collecting from around the Cosmere different forms of power, or investiture as the kids are calling it. And if you've read the Stormlight Archive, you probably recall this group being presented a bit more villainously. Here they actually get to be heroes. After all, the group's express purpose is to protect Scadrial, this world. So they are going to support our heroes in that regard. What's weird about this is that if you've read the Stormlight Archive and the Rhythm of War specifically, this plotline where someone is being scouted to join the Ghostbloods working alongside them, it might seem a little bit familiar. There are just a lot of obvious similarities that can be drawn between Shallan's plotline in the Stormlight Archive and what Marasi's up to in the Lost Metal. Now, I for one think these similarities are largely superficial, but they're still very obvious similarities, and if you've read these other books in the Cosmere, I think you might find yourself being a little bit distracted the same way that I was. Really, if you float in any Sanderson community online, you also don't need to go very far before you find someone making the Phineas and Ferb, Heinz Doofenshmirtz, if I had 2 nickels joke. I do think this plotline largely holds up on its own, though. And the motivations and reasoning behind what characters do in this plot differ significantly from what happens in the Stormlight Archive. But again, I'd be a liar if I said the resemblance wasn't distracting. Now, I do like how this all plays out, but there is one weird thing that I want to bring up with Morrissey's side of the story here. There's a late game twist in her story that's actually so good I don't even want to spoil it here in the spoiler talk. See, the climax of this book is, I would say, 90% satisfying, but the part that isn't satisfying is Morrissey's part. Wax and Wayne are having a great confrontation with villains who have similar powers to them someplace else. And meanwhile, Morrissey is just in this part of the book that feels like it should be a whole lot more interesting. The problem isn't that it's bad. The problem is that this twist, this excellent twist, comes so late in the story, there's just not enough pages left to properly flesh it out. But I mentioned Wax and Wayne's side of things. Again, I think this portion of the climax is very well executed. I like how everything plays out, but if there's one thing I wish could have been different, I wish that Wax... Someone's on a bike outside. If there's one thing, though, that I wish could have gotten more play, I wish that Wax and his relationship with his sister could have been explored a little bit more. Simply put, there's this lack of closure, and I guess part of what Wax has had to learn is that he's not going to get that closure with his sister because she doesn't particularly want to reconcile in any conceivable way, but I just feel like there's an interesting relationship here that's being alluded to a bit in this story that just doesn't get any play ultimately. This is another one to chalk up to missed opportunity rather than something actually being bad. As for the end, I'm gonna be perfectly honest, I'm not exactly a teary-eyed reader. Like, I'll cry at movies and at songs, which my wife will make fun of me for. I want to be perfectly clear, she's not making fun of me because I cry, that would be mean. She's making fun of me because I cry a lot. But I don't usually cry while reading something. I've seen some people say here that the ending of this book is a tearjerker, and I've just got to take their word on it. That said, though, I do feel like the ending was satisfying and appropriate. Anyway, that ends the spoiler talk. The Lost Metal is a very crowded book. It's trying to take all of these things from all of these other books and put them together in this one spot and tie them up nicely. Ultimately, I think The Lost Metal is a worthy conclusion to this second era of Mistborn books. My opinions are still likely to change, but I'd say I liked this one better than Shadows of Self, although I think I still enjoyed The Alloy of Law and The Bands of Mourning more, but that might change. The big thing I want to make clear is I can't tell you that this is the new best Sanderson book. He's not going to top himself with every new release, and honestly it's kind of unreasonable to expect any author to do that. But all of that said, I think this book is a success, if a messy one. There are aggravating things about it, but I can't really deny that I had a good time reading this book. I think when it comes to long series like these, whether it's Mistborn, the second era of Mistborn, or even just the Cosmere in general, the question isn't, was this book good or bad? The question is, when I get around to rereading this series, am I going to get to this one and go, oh, this one? And for me personally, I can say I'm not going to feel that way. I think I'm going to really enjoy this one when I come back on future read-throughs, especially now that I know what does and doesn't pay off. I feel like I'm better equipped. It's a little rickety, the paint's scratched in a few places, but when it flies like a dream. It's probably not going to be your new favorite, but The Lost Metal was well worth the wait. Thanks for watching. Wow, that came out a little bit longer than I remember. I can feel my leg buzzing with my phone in my pocket with all the notifications I set to mute 90 minutes ago. If you're new here, wow, I hope I made a good first impression. If you liked what you saw, it'd be super awesome if you could maybe click some of those YouTube buttons, leave a like, a subscribe, maybe a comment. Or if you're thinking you might want to hear more of my voice, I have a whole slew of other videos where I've been talking about all of the other Mistborn books leading up to this one. And sometimes my wife posts things here too. We are the Bookcases. Our thing is we're married and we like to read books and review our books on the internet. Sue us. My wife has asked me to clarify we would like you to not pursue legal action against us. At any rate, check out some of her stuff. Anyhow, I'm Steven. This is the Bookcase. Go have fun reading something.